to Christ the Center, your weekly conversation of Reformed theology. We're now up to episode number 622. My name's Camden Busey. I'm here in Grays Lake, Illinois at the Reformed Forum office and studio. And I'm delighted to be back today with an international panel. We're going to be speaking with several people. We've got a large group and tremendously excited to speak about a new book by Herman Bavinck titled Christian Worldview. It's new for us in English, and we have a new translation and an edition here, a reprint of and a translation of the second edition on his book Christian Worldview, which has been translated and edited by Nathaniel Gray Sutanto, James Eglinton, and Cory Brock, who we have as guests. Before we introduce them and talk to them briefly, let me introduce to you our colleague. We have Jim Cassidy, who serves as pastor of South Austin OPC in South Austin, Texas. Welcome back, Jim. It's good to see you.
Hey, Camden, this is great. I'm looking forward to this discussion. This should be a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Really excited to have you with us today, and looking forward to talk about this. Obviously, we love Bavinck, and anything we can do to talk about him and promote his work, we're happy to do so. And that is really what's up for us today, because we have these brothers with us. With Gray and Cory have been on the program before talking Bavinck, but we're pleased to welcome the whole crew. So let me introduce to you first. We'll introduce Dr. James Eglinton, who is the Meldrum Lecturer in Reformed Theology at New College, the University of Edinburgh. He's the author of Trinity and Organism, as well as a forthcoming volume, Bavinck, a critical biography, coming out from Baker Academic next year. Welcome, James. It's great to meet you. Great to see you and talk to you today.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Kind of you to host us.
Well, you're very kind to join us. So we have you from overseas. So we're represented from multiple continents today, because we also have Gray Sutanto, Nathaniel Gray Sutanto, the full academic name here, who is a teaching elder at Covenant City Church in Jakarta, Indonesia. He also studied at the University of Edinburgh under Dr. Eglinton and has written several things on Bavinck and is widely published. You can check his CV out. We'll have a link to that in the episode description. Welcome back, Gray. It's always good to talk to you too.
Great to be back.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. At the time for you, I think we're pushing 10:33 p.m., where it's 9:33 a.m. for me. So thanks for
keeping me awake. So as he should.
Thank you for persevering. We're happy to have you, and looking forward to a fun conversation. And I'm also very pleased to welcome to the program Cory Brock. He also studied at Edinburgh, and Cory is the minister for young adults and college at First Presbyterian Church, none other than in Jackson, Mississippi. He also serves as adjunct professor of theology at Belhaven University nearby. Welcome back, Cory. It's good to see you too.
Thanks for having me back, Camden.
Yeah, well, it's been a little while. I don't recall the last time we spoke, but we had a good conversation last time, and I'm excited to talk today about this subject matter and to continue our conversation and promotion of this kind of Bavinck Renaissance. I mentioned before, just with the publication of Reformed Dogmatics in English, I think the first edition was widely available around 2003, if I'm not mistaken. And, till then, there wasn't a whole lot available. I think Our Reasonable Faith was out, and that's not even the direct title. I've got a copy here of the forthcoming The Wonderful Works of God. People might be able to see on the video. But other than that, for English speakers, there wasn't a whole lot available to my knowledge. But that led to a great increase in scholarship on Herman Bavinck, such a tremendous thinker. And now we're reaping the benefits, and we can actually see, in terms of like a historical theological study, what these translations can do. So now as we see other translations, on figures like Maastricht and others, so much of the Protestant scholastics are now being translated and made available in English for the first time. I pray and hope that there'll be a renaissance, 15, 20 years now down the road in those areas too. It's always helpful for us to learn the originals and to read primary sources in the original languages. But we know just, for every seminary student, don't have a working knowledge of Latin, and certainly not Dutch and other languages. But we have some very capable scholars with us today. Even before we get started, James, I'd like to introduce you to our audience and let you speak a bit about some of your scholarly work and how you got to studying Bavinck in the first place. And I see on your page for the University of Edinburgh that you not only can speak and write, but in English and Dutch, but also in French and in Scottish Gaelic, I understand.
Yes.
So tell me a bit about your scholarly work and just introduce yourself, if you would, to the listeners. We'd love to hear it.
Yeah, sure. So I did my undergrad in law at the University of Aberdeen, which I enjoyed in parts and not in others. But so that was my, major, in US terms. And but in the Scottish university system, you can make up lots of other classes, something like a minor. So I did a year of New Testament Greek and took some theological classes and really loved it. So then after I finished my law degree, I went to seminary to the Free Church College in Edinburgh and studied under Donald MacLeod, who would quote
Wonderful.
this guy, Herman Bavinck, from time to time in class and would encourage us to think about researching him more. And so one thing led to another, and ended up doing a PhD on Bavinck at the University of Edinburgh and discovered him through that. So I moved into that just as the English translations of the dogmatics were starting to appear. So providentially, it was a really good time to enter that field. I wanted to work on a theologian who where there was still a lot of space to do new work, which is really difficult for some theologians because there's so many interpreters who've been around, and there's some really crowded fields. And Bavinck
Like
was
Bart.
really attractive. Yes, exactly. So so much of the seminal work has been done on how to interpret Bart. So it's very hard not to be peripheral in those conversations if you're trying to set out nowadays. Whereas for Bavinck, there was just so much unexplored territory, and there was space to do something really fundamental on how his thought works. So I fell into it through that. I didn't want to work on a theologian who wrote in English because I thought I'll only do this PhD once, and I want to use this as a chance to pick up a new language. So thought, let's go for someone who wrote in Dutch as well. And there weren't really that many people around working on Dutch theology back then. There are more people now, so it's a busier environment, shall we say. But yes, I was really drawn to it because there was so much potential to explore new things.
Oh, that's
and Bavinck's just
brilliant.
such a great thinker and so winsome, and a real role model if you want to be a Christian theologian in the mainstream academy and engage with people who differ from you and how they think about theology. Bavinck is a really superb example of how to do that.
He's tremendous. I'm never disappointed reading Bavinck, and he's such a wonderful example. And I mean, even if I didn't agree with him pretty much on every single page, I still would enjoy reading him and find him very fruitful. So he is just a tremendous scholar and a figure to study, really significant. Just for people who don't know, Bavinck's dates, I mean, everyone should have an idea, but some people might be listening for the first time and not know. But Bavinck's dates are 1854 to 1921. So we're speaking about some very interesting, somewhat tumultuous times, but there's a lot going on in the culture, and we're going to get into that as we talk about this book, Christian Worldview. I'm curious, brothers, whoever wants to pick up the question and run with it, how this particular project came about. If you could give us a little bit of a background about this original publication, its editions, and then how you picked it up and translated it. How did what I'm holding in my hands now, what's the story behind it? How did it get here?
Yeah, I mean, we could say, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, I had a conversation with Johnny Gibson, who's now the Old Testament professor at Westminster Theological Seminary. And Johnny, as an Old Testament guy, was really interested still in Reformed theology and, of course, in Reformed theologians. And one of his favorites anyway, would be Herman Bavinck.
Mm-hmm.
And he's reading through the dogmatics, I think, at the time. And he just asked, are there a lot of other works that haven't yet been translated? And I said, there's this one book that I'm constantly reading through and I'm using all the time for my own PhD work. It's called Christian Worldview in the Dutch. And he just had a glimmer in his eye and he says, that's going to sell like hotcakes. And they just did From Heaven He Came and Sought Her for Crossway. And so he had a good connection with them and sent an email out to them, and they invited a proposal on it. And so I got working on the proposal, met with Justin Taylor, I think in ETS 2017, finalized it all and set to work. And of course, I knew that this is too important of a work for me to tackle on my own, and I wanted Cory and James to be involved from the very beginning. This is definitely one of the more mature epistemological works by Bavinck. I definitely think that in this particular work, along with Philosophy of Revelation, we see him developing his organic epistemology in a more self-conscious way because he's dedicating this focus and time and energy toward it. And in 1904, when he first published Christian Worldview, he also published another book called Christelijk Wetenschap, which translation would be Christian scholarship. That's kind of a companion volume to this work. They were published at around the same time. And there, he tries to develop the principles that we find here to the different sciences that we see in the university, whether it be the natural sciences, the humanities, religious studies, and tries to show how a Christian perspective can actually impact these different fields in a unique way. So in here, we see a more fundamental orientation, maybe, where he's developing a Christian worldview for metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. There, he tries to apply it to different fields of scholarship. So you see this focus on Bavinck. Maybe it's also because he's transitioning to the Free University of Amsterdam, which James could tell you a lot more about because he just wrote the biography. And so he's wrestling with what makes a Reformed university distinct, what makes a Christian worldview distinct. And so 1904, he wrote those two works, and then which anticipates 1908 Philosophy of Revelation. But the principles, of course, that you see here are organically built from the dogmatics and his 1897 work on the principles of psychology, but definitely a strongly epistemological focus as he transitions into Amsterdam.
Yeah,
that's the story about the book and also how it came about, I guess.
That's great.
Yeah.
Corey?
Yeah, there's also a couple other things to mention. I think one is, in his own context, Bavinck saw Christian worldview as a prequel to the philosophy of revelation. So, and he footnotes that and mentions it explicitly. And, we published Philosophy of Revelation a year ago or so, and met with you about that, Kampen. And so this was an important book to read alongside Philosophy of Revelation. And in that way, it'll be important for anybody studying Bavinck to read those two together. But also, there's a contemporary reason too, and that's that the discussion about worldview and Christian worldview and any worldview has been very prominent in the past couple of years in Reformed theology in the States, especially. A lot of people are asking questions about whether the concept is valid and whether we need to dismiss the idea of worldview altogether.
Right.
And,
there's a lot of disparaging comments on the subject. It's become kind of a pastime of some people to just trash worldview thinking or say it's just Enlightenment thought.
And there are some good critiques of the evolution that the concept has undergone in American evangelicalism, for sure. But we wanted to offer this book as kind of more of an original primary source to think, well, what were the best thinkers thinking about what this word means in the early 20th, late 19th century. So
it's brilliant.
Yeah.
James, I'm wondering if we could pick up on something Gray said in terms of the Free University and some of the other contexts. Can you situate this book for us within Bavinck's biography, and that might shed some light on us on this subject historically and help us understand it?
I think probably the best way to think about this book is to understand it as one of the key early publications in a new phase of Bavinck's theological development. So if you think of Bavinck's life, he spent the 1880s and 90s as a professor in a small seminary in Kampen in the theological school. And his main dialogue partners at that stage were either liberal Protestants or they were materialist atheists. So there was this trend towards atheism in Dutch intellectual culture, but where it was a kind of atheism that said, we don't need God, but we still retain all of the moral trappings of theism. So it's still wrong to steal, it's still wrong to kill, it's still wrong to oppress people in the Dutch East Indies. It's still wrong to do all those things, but there's no God, and we don't need a church to tell us any of those things. And that in those decades, Bavinck believed that the Orthodox theism was going to win out, and that it wasn't going to be too long before the Dutch as a nation turned back towards the best kind of Calvinism. Because what they were trying to sustain just wouldn't work. And he thought that people would really prize consistency ultimately, and then they would come back to a really healthy, well-orbed, Orthodox Calvinist worldview and life view for the whole nation. But then everything changes in 1900. So it's 2 years before he moves to the Free University of Amsterdam, but that's the year in which Friedrich Nietzsche dies. And Nietzsche had almost no impact in the Netherlands in his own lifetime. But then after he dies, it's almost like a cult of Nietzsche develops in Dutch society, where there are all these intellectuals and poets and political activists who really start to run with Nietzsche's ideas that if God is dead because we have killed him, we have to revalue all values. And all of a sudden, this, as a species of atheism, it's completely novel. The idea that there may be no God, and because of that, we don't know if any of the old values still remain. So when Bavinck in the 1880s and 90s was debating with Dutch atheists, he had a common moral framework that he could discuss with them and share with them and talk into. And there was still a lot that they depended on Christianity for, even if they'd rejected belief in God. But then after the death of Nietzsche, there's a completely new kind of atheist that Bavinck is staring at, and he has no common language anymore to talk with them in. He doesn't have any common guaranteed set of moral commitments that are just givens. And he realizes fairly quickly after the death of Nietzsche and the Dutch cult of Nietzsche springs up that his theological foes from the previous couple of decades also face the same existential threat from Nietzsche, because the Nietzschean Übermensch, this kind of new way of being human that Nietzsche dreams up, where it's all about domination and chopping down the tree of theism, and so that all the branches of it fall, whether that's liberal Protestantism or Catholicism or Calvinism. So all of these different branches of theology all face the same existential threat. So Bavinck then starts to invest a lot of energy in, as well as promoting Calvinism, and promoting Christianity and encouraging people within different traditions within Christianity to think a lot about what it means to be Christian and face the threat of Nietzsche as well. So so Christianity emerges as a really major public theme in Bavinck's life from kind of 1902 onwards, or 1904 with this publication. So it's why you get lots of publications about Christian science. There's a book he writes that's just called Christendom, Christianity, Christian Worldview. So he's trying to gather some kind of like a broadly theistic coalition that recognizes that in this context they stand or fall together, even if he's not relativizing theological difference, but there's this new setting where they face a new foe that they haven't faced before, with a completely new kind of atheism. So this Übermensch is coming, and he doesn't come with pruning shears to snip off some parts of this tree. He's coming with an axe, and the axe is going to chop the whole thing down. There's this new threat, and because of that, Christianity has to be stressed alongside defending Calvinism. But I think one of the ways that I tried to understand this is that if you live by a stream and it's what you get your water from, it sustains you, and you think that it's the stream of where you have the most beautiful clean water, and there are lots of other streams that flow off some kind of common river, and that someone is coming to build a dam a few miles up, and everything that flows from it will dry up. You go and tackle the person who's building the dam. And that for Bavinck is Nietzsche, and he's trying to convince everyone else by all of their streams within the kind of a broad Christian view of Christian traditions, that they're all facing this new threat together. And so he's trying to convince all these liberal theologians, the modern theologians as they were called in that time, that their opposition to him was really myopic, that Bavinck isn't the threat that they face. The big threat they face is Nietzsche.
Wow. So with that being said, so we've got this tremendous context at this turn of the century, and this is what Bavinck is fighting, and he's trying to awaken Christians to a deeper, more thoughtful approach to the challenges ahead. And one way he does that in this book is present a Christian worldview. That, as we've already alluded to, is indicating, that word means a lot of things to a lot of people. And so I'm curious as to how Bavinck defines the term, if he's appropriating an idea that's already existent within, Dutch Calvinism, or how does Bavinck come to use this term, and what does he mean by it as he's addressing here these challenges?
Yeah, he hadn't really dealt much with the term worldview, also in the 1880s and 90s. So he dealt with it a little bit really early in his academic career. He wrote a review of a book by James Orr, I think, the Scottish theologian, who wrote a bit about worldview. But he really doesn't mention it much in those decades. So something that becomes extremely important because of the existential threat to being able to view all of life holistically through the lens of the Catholic Christian faith. that comes about again through Nietzsche. So it's this turn of the century that changes everything. If you pick up this book expecting a really neat definition of worldview that you can
right.
just deduce in 2 sentences and walk away from without it being an effort, you'll probably be disappointed. That's not what Bavinck is trying to do. He is trying to ask a series of short, basic, and profound questions that he thinks you need to ask and answer and put together in order to live well within the world and before the face of God. Questions about who am I, what is the world, and then what do I do in living within the world. And so Bavinck actually prefers to speak the language of world and life, because it's not just this kind of abstract cosmology or some kind of facile social model or something like that you have a Christian worldview if you drive a certain kind of car, or if you read a certain newspaper or something like that. A Christian worldview is something that develops organically as you live within the world, having engaged with these questions about what it means for me to be me, to exist, what it means for what is the world, and then thinking through then how do I live to the glory of God within the world. So a Christian worldview is something that kind of springs up, it grows up in that soil, but you have to kind of break up the dry hardened ground in the first place to let it bear, to let it become more fruitful.
Mm-hmm. I think it's worth mentioning too that Christian world and life view for Bavinck is essentially like saying Christian philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
He sees this as Christian philosophy, and the reason he prefers world and life view is because world is a reference to epistemology and ontology, and life is a reference to wisdom and ethics. And so that's why he doesn't want to shorten the term to worldview. And that speaks to a lot of the issues actually that are brought up in the contemporary world, in the conversation about worldview, just even switching the terminology to world and life, where life references human action, wisdom, ethics, and religion, is an address to some of the criticisms that are out there about the mutation of the concept over time.
Yeah.
It's for the reader, the listener, there's only 3 chapters here. The whole book, including the scripture index, is about 140 some pages, but the first chapter is thinking and being, second chapter being and becoming, and the third chapter becoming and acting. But Bavinck does provide a very holistic understanding of the Christian, just of the human living in this world, and what are the necessary preconditions, to use some Van Tillian terms. But to carry on what you were saying, Cory, on page 55, he finishes that chapter just saying, the same God needed by the pious believer and the philosopher is the one who makes himself known to both in his works. It's the same Word who made all things and who, in the fullness of time, became flesh. The same Spirit who renews the face of the earth, changes the heart of the sinner, and thus, verus philosophus amator Dei, the true philosopher is a lover of God. And Christianus verus philosophus, a Christian is a true philosopher. And I just loved how he worded that and what that means for him. That these two are not competing departments of knowledge or investigation, in Christianity on the one hand or philosophy on the other, or to have some sort of Kantian divide of, some sort of realm of noumenal faith and then the realm of like a practical reason where, the philosopher is trying to investigate nature, which has nothing to do with God. It's all bound up, and knowledge of this world necessarily involves knowledge of God, whether we acknowledge that or not. Is this how the world is made? So that's a helpful way to put it. And I think that little paragraph or those few sentences is a window into a whole world of kind of Bavinckian thought.
Another way to say it. Sorry, go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I do think that, picking up on what both of you guys said, that, Bavinck is after a very holistic vision of all things and a holistic way of living. And he unfolds science and wisdom under this category of worldview. And worldview stems out of science and wisdom, but worldview circles back around to science and wisdom. So I do think that he gets at he doesn't really get a definition of worldview per se, but he gets at a method of building worldview.
He shows it to you. Yeah. He lives it to you. Yeah.
51. In pages 50 and 51, he talks about how at the a couple of lines after that first full paragraph, it says, just as sense perception is the basis of all science, the results of science are and remain the starting point of philosophy. So he's trying to argue there that you start off with science and sense perception and you get your material from there. But he doesn't want to limit it to just science, because a few lines after that, it says that wisdom is grounded on science. So science is a starting point for wisdom, but it's not limited to it. It aims above science and seeks to press through to first principles, and tries therefore to trace back all the sciences back to their first principles. And then he's going to argue the very beginning of the next paragraph, a couple lines down, it says, the world rests in thoughts and that ideas control all things. So he's trying to say, you start off with science, you start out with sense perception, you build up with the data inductively, then you trace back all this data to the first principles. Once you get to the first principles, you realize that ideas control all things. And then in the next page, it says that it is built on the realities of ideas because it is indeed the science of the idea, Wissenschaft der Idee. And because it seeks the idea of the whole and the parts and of the general in particular, it tacitly proceeds from the Christian faith, which states that the world is grounded in wisdom and reveals wisdom in its whole and all in its parts. And then, of course, he talks about the organic motif there. So he's trying to say, once you get to the first principles, you find out that the first principles for every science are actually divine ideas. And so a worldview seeks to find the unity behind the disparate sciences, a unity behind the first principles. And those principles for religion, all different sciences are actually the same. And you asked about sources too, Kampen. He cites there Friedrich von Trendelenburg, who is a German empirical idealist. And some people think that empiricist and idealism, they're basically a binary, but Trendelenburg's existence actually contradicts that, because he's an empiricist, but at the same time, he argues that as you empirically study the world, you're going to discover that ideas govern the whole thing. And he cites that German philosopher there. So that's an interesting thing. But I do think that page 50 and 51, he gets at the method of worldview very clearly.
Yeah. You know, that carries on just on the, not to just be pulling quotes all the time, but just the reference to the being and becoming chapter right at the beginning. It says, the second problem solved in our worldview is that of being and becoming, of unity and multiplicity of God and world. And that just, you know, me, I love Cornelius Van Til, and I read him a lot, and very indebted to his mode of thinking. And I think he's often misunderstood, especially by his critics. But nevertheless, my thought as I was reading that is how much, you know, Bavinck's language is maybe lurking in the background of Van Til's comments on the problem of the one and the many, of unity and diversity, and he applies that to the subject-object relations and his own epistemology. I can't help but think, you know, do we have any understanding or awareness that you know, Van Til was conversant with all of these works? No doubt he was reading a lot of this stuff in Dutch, but were there any thoughts in terms of Bavinck's influence on Van Til and others, you know, in the space? I don't know, Stoker or other, that next wave or generation of kind of Dutch thinkers?
Definitely, you can trace it. I'd be interested to see where the footnotes go with respect to what Van Til is citing.
Yeah, or his letters. I need that. Partially have been working on a lot of his, you know, transcribing a lot of his letters. It'd be curious to keep that in mind as we read the letters, to figure out, you know, what's going on in the background. But, you know, it's interesting to me to see that Van Til's not novel. I mean, he never said he was, but people often assume that what he's thinking is he's just coming up with all these ideas and he's inventing them all. And you can have, you know, different thoughts about how faithful he might be to the tradition, or if he's departing from it or developing it. But I think a book like this shows that this is in the air.
I mean, the worldview thing is I mean, James had mentioned that before. James Orr had written The Christian View of the World, right? And Bavinck reviews it positively. So you can find the review. I don't think it's translated yet, as far as I know. And then, of course, a precedent for this particular book and the Kuyperian movement as a whole is Groen van Prinsterer. And he tries to argue that the French Revolution has to be understood as a whole system, that this is actually a manifestation of a whole atheistic, anti-theistic system of belief, and that you have to trace it back down to first principles.
I gotcha.
And I do think that Bavinck is therefore picking up on those pre-Kuyperian moves. And of course, Abraham Kuyper looms largely as well. But I do confess that as we were translating this, as we saw the importance of it, at least speaking for myself, I did see this whole pitting of 17th century Reform orthodoxy. There were four metaphysics, as if that's one thing. And then 19th century worldview is just idealism, and subjective idealism particularly.
Right.
I just think that that's a false binary. I actually think that a Christian worldview depends upon a Christian ontology. And that's what Bavinck was doing. He's just trying to show that we all felt this disunity that secularism has brought about between our beings and ourselves, and our beings and the world. And can we have a unified Christian vision of all things rooted in a Christian ontology? And so we have subject and object reconciled. We have the world and ourselves reconciled. We can make sense of progress, but at the same time, there's still a unity within the progress. He's trying to show that ontology is the root of worldview, and worldview is basically a unified vision of ontology. And I think that's something that's the best. If we want to read Van Til, I think that's the best way we should read Van Til, not as someone who breaks away from Reform orthodoxy, but he's basically following this, not just Bavinck, but Kuyperian move of standing on Reform orthodoxy, but bringing a lot of, dare I say, romantic and new unified visions of life that have been brought out in 19th century philosophy.
Well, it's a very pastoral question, I gathered as I was reading the book at hand here today, Bavinck's Christian Worldview, that this new generation had arisen that exchanged modernistic certainty for an appreciation in the unrecognizable and unknowable. So he keeps talking about these shifts in the culture, and he seemed to have a very pastoral heart right at the beginning of what he's attempting to address with this little book is answer some of the, these existential questions that people are having as they're kind of tossed to and fro in the world and not knowing how to make sense of it. Because a previous secular, unbelieving way of making sense of the world, that's fallen apart. And, but without the triune God as revealed in Scripture and as he has revealed himself even in the world, if you're not going to start there as your starting point epistemologically, ontologically, however you want to begin, you're not going to find the answer, and you're only going to find meaninglessness. And so I found this isn't just some sort of abstract book where some contemplation about some bizarre epistemological facts. This is a pastoral book in many ways.
Yes, and it began in a pastoral context towards his students as well, because the first edition, before it was a book, it was a rectorial address to the students of the Free University. So, and Bavinck had only been there for 2 years, but the rector post changed every year. So he was the rector for a year, and then you would give lectures to the students. Give a lecture at the beginning of your year as rector, another one at the end. So this is his closing address to the students as rector. So, and to be a theology student in the Netherlands in that period was, you were really at the very front line of huge debates that were really, existential and that had a huge bearing on what your life would be like and, what your convictions would go on to be. And Bavinck wants the students at the Free University to hold fast to their faith. They're in the heart of Amsterdam, they're part of their wider culture, and they're not hermetically sealed from that because this new confessionally reformed university, or not confessionally reformed, but based on reformed principles explicitly, I should say, at their university. So it is pastoral. These aren't abstract concerns. He's trying to help his students navigate really choppy waters.
Well, he also ends the book pastorally. In just the very last 2 pages, he says that a true Christian world and life view is a way of being, not merely a way of knowing. And he talks about how to imbibe that way of being, what has to be present is what must be present for a true dogmatician to do dogmatics. And that's communion with the living God. He says that religion, true religion, in the sense of how Calvin would say it perhaps, is a precondition for any Christian world and life view. It cannot be a mere intellectualism. It has to be brought on through the life of prayer, the means of grace, true communion with God, and that's the last thing he says in the work. It's how he ends the third chapter.
That's interesting. It sounds a whole lot like Voss, doesn't it? You know, the way in which Voss develops his idea and his ideas and his theology really as a holistic system, with regard to the necessary precondition of communion with the living triune God. I have a question about, it's more of a historical curiosity than anything. Can you situate this volume in the historical context, especially relative to Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism? Because as I read Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism, I see there really somebody who is developing a Christian worldview, self-consciously developing a Christian world and life view, something that's going to be holistic and organic in terms of how we view life and epistemology and ontology and everything. How do we situate Bavinck's volume here relative to the lectures on Calvinism?
It's an interesting comparison. Bavinck himself was actually critical of Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism, appreciative in some ways, but privately critical and directly towards Kuyper. There's a really fascinating lecture from Bavinck to Kuyper about his lectures on Calvinism, where he said that Bavinck doubted that the American audience was familiar enough with all of this philosophical background, the kind of stuff that we have in Bavinck's Christian worldview, to make sense of what Kuyper was actually saying. So he thought that Kuyper had really aimed over people's heads because they didn't have the kind of background that was necessary to make sense of a neo-Calvinist worldview. So he was critical in that regard. And he was also critical of Kuyper attempting to articulate the specifics of a Christian worldview in another culture, an American culture, as a Dutchman. So he said, so he thought that you cannot you can't tell other people what this has to look like in their culture. You do this where you're from, so you let this worldview develop more organically. But Bavinck was just kind of skeptical about whether a Christian worldview in America would ever take the shape that Kuyper was trying to encourage it to take. So there's really interesting critique there. I think there's a little bit of tension in the background. It has a lot to do with personalities as well. And then, of course, Bavinck gave the Stone lectures in Princeton a while after this, and then he also thought that his wife's remarks in it were that she thought that he was really struggling to connect with his audience, and that they didn't seem to understand what he was saying either. And philosophy of revelation. So the critique of Kuyper came back to haunt him because his wife basically said, "Herman, this is happening to you too."
Yeah, philosophy of revelation was definitely not philosophically light.
Yeah.
No doubt.
I'm writing a chapter on Kuyper and Bavinck's use of Calvinism because, of course, you asked the question about Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism, the relationship with that with Bavinck. The word Calvinism it just played so massively in the Kuyperian and Bavinckian imagination, especially in Bavinck's earlier writings, right? And interestingly, in Bavinck's lecture, "The Future of Calvinism," he argues that Calvinism is a broader term than the term Reformed. Reformed is just about doctrine and it's about ecclesiology, but Calvinism is a whole world and life view. It has to do with reforming the whole culture. It has to do with reforming science, art, and every sphere of life, because that's what Calvin was doing in Geneva, and the Dutch could do in their own context, and the Americans could do in their own context. I think that's what Bavinck was envisioning. And so I guess that's one also ideological connection between Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism and Bavinck's own thought, is that they have always seen Calvin and Calvin's work in Geneva as an exemplary model to follow, that Christianity ought to leaven everything, and Christianity is not just a pearl, but ought to leaven every area of life. Not just to imitate Calvin's Geneva, but in our own context, what do we do now to leaven and to show how Christianity impacts every area of life?
That's fascinating. Right. Let's get into some of the more nuts and bolts. I mean, we've been talking a lot about some of these things and alluding to them, but I'm curious more how Bavinck works out this epistemology and the world and life view. he makes a comment about his, regarding his understanding of thinking and being and how it might serve to reconcile the human being with God, the world, and life. I mean, what are some of the ontological foundations and some of the ways in which Bavinck connects subject and object and human with God? Let's get into a little bit of the theological particulars on this, because I think it's helpful to understand, and might connect this book more with the traditional textbook we might find, like with Reformed dogmatics, for example.
It might be helpful just to say that these shorthand terms, thinking, being, becoming, acting, thinking and being, thinking for Bavinck here stands for the intellectual life of the human subject.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he means. And being stands for existence outside the subject. So any object in the world that can be known, that's what he means by being. Thinking is the process of consciousness and intellectual processing, the world of representations in the human mind. And so these little shorthand phrases have a ton of baggage attached to them. They're largely being picked up from in conversation with the thought life of Immanuel Kant.
Mm-hmm.
To be sure. This is Gray's area of particular enjoyment, I think. So he might.
Oh man, I love that you said that with such glee, Cory. So something toward me. Definitely, I think so. The particularities of Bavinck's argumentation here is he's always going to posit Christianity as the more holistic alternative to two options. And with respect to the first chapter on epistemology, he's going to argue that Christianity is the holistic alternative to rationalism and empiricism. And he argues that, ironically, both rationalism and empiricism can't bridge the subject-object distinction, right? So this is in page 32. I'm not going to read it, and people could read it for themselves. But page 32, he says that in empiricism, you're always going to distinguish between the representations that you get from the impressions from the outside and the thing in itself. And so you're actually getting an ever greater gap between the image or the idea of the thing and the thing itself, even though the impression from the thing outside creates the idea within us. And rationalism, on the other hand, tries to move from the mind to reality and say, if I have these ideas, I need to project them onto reality in some way. But both can't actually secure an equal ultimacy, if I could put it that way, or a equilibrium, or an equipoisity. Man, it's like all 11:15 p.m. here. I'm trying to articulate my words well. But an equal place for both subject and object, and hold them both together in intention and yet still connected, distinct but connected, unity but diversity, right? And so he tries to show that both of these movements in modern thought can actually bridge that gap. And Bavinck ultimately says that the only way we can bridge that gap is that we have to presuppose the knowability of the external world, of course. But interestingly enough, and this is why I argue that he's not a common sense realist, on page 40, at the top of it, again, I'm not going to read it, he says that the knowability of the external world is of such a great presupposition that you have to justify it. So he says that both empiricism and rationalism can't purchase the knowability of the external world. We have to believe in the knowability of the external world, but we can't just posit the knowability. We have to actually provide some justification for it, some reasons to believe that we can believe in the externality of the world and that it's accessible to us. And so in the rest of the chapter, I think he appeals to at least three doctrines to justify why it is that the world is knowable to the subject, and that the subject and object can be held together, distinct but still united. And the three, I think, doctrines that he refers to would be the doctrine of creation through the Word of God, and that this creation from the Word of God unites diverse things together, precisely because they all stem from the divine ideas in God. So the divine ideas hold natural and supernatural things together, and therefore in creation we're going to see both spiritual things and material things come together, even the way we know things. So creation is in there, divine ideas, and it's I think a Reformed Orthodox doctrine of divine ideas that you see in the Reformed scholastics. He's going to quote Johann Alstedt there. And also at the same time, I think this organic decree that binds all things in history, particulars and universals, individuals, the subject and the object together. So again, page 51, I will read this one. He says there, it is the same divine wisdom that created the world organically into a connected whole and planted in us the urge of a unified worldview. If this is possible, it can only be explained on the basis of the claim that the world is an organism and has first been thought of as such. Only then do philosophy and worldview have a right and ground of existence, as it is also on this high point of knowledge that subject and object harmonize, as the reason within us corresponds with the principia of all being and knowing. So he's saying, why do the ideas in our minds, which are different from physical things outside, correspond? Well, because they're both partaking in this organic universe,
Right.
ordained by the triune God, patterned after the archetypal divine ideas in God.
In other words, that's a gift of common grace as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when I read the Reformed dogmatics, he seems to, in this regard, place a premium on the doctrine of the Trinity as the precondition for understanding both unity and diversity within the created order. Does the doctrine of the Trinity come out? I mean, you mentioned several others here, Gray, but I haven't read the book yet, so I'm asking out of ignorance. What role does the doctrine of the Trinity have then with regard to answering these questions about the knowability of the external world?
Yeah, so I think massively, at least with regard to the Logos doctrine, it's going to appear here pretty significantly as well. When he talks about the doctrine of creation on page 46, he specifically appeals to the doctrine of creation of all things by the word of God. And he capitalizes the word there, I think in reference to the second person of the Trinity, that it is the explanation of all knowing and knowing about, the presupposition behind the correspondence between subject and object. And then he talks about how God has ordained what is seen and what is unseen to go together and to be able to be made known to us. So I do think that it's more implicit here, I think, at least in this particular section, that because there is a sense in which there's distinction in God, not a substantial or essential distinction, of course, but a personal distinction, that creation is, through God, but through the word of God specifically, that there's also diversity within creation. And hence we are not surprised that spiritual ideas can still communicate to us physical realities. Heterogeneous realities are connected precisely because there's archetypal unity and diversity in God. But I do, and you guys could correct me if I'm wrong here, Cory and James especially, like I do think that the Trinity is more explicit in the dogmatics, but I think that all the seeds of the Trinity are still within this particular book.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely there, Gray. And again, if you remember that this is an address Bavinck gives as rector to the students of the Free University. It was an address that Kuyper gave to the students relatively close by to this in the chronology, where he sets out the rationale for how to study these different disciplines within the Free University and do so Christianly, which is entirely and explicitly based on this logos idea as well, that if you're a Christian biologist, you're studying plants and animals, but really what you're studying is the logos in all of these things. And it's the same if you're a Christian lawyer or if you're a Christian social anthropologist. So there's this logos doctrine that's being used to explain the sense in which all of these different avenues of inquiry are now Christianized and hang together and hold together within a single Christian university. So I agree with Gray entirely that the logos doctrine is really important as an aspect of thinking in a Trinitarian way about all of life and how to study across a university and what makes it a university rather than just a fragmented, arbitrary collection of departments. But I think, and I agree with Gray also that the Trinity is more obviously prominent in the Reformed dogmatics because of the nature of the purpose of the Reformed dogmatics. It's there to do dogmatic theology. It's there'd be something really surprising if the Trinity wasn't very clearly explicitly stated and articulated. There'd be a big disappointment if that weren't the case. But I think one of the key things about Bavinck's handling of the Trinity, which is really interesting and kind of idiosyncratic as well in his emphasis, is that there's this 3-in-1 pattern in the Trinity of unity, and it is a form of unity in diversity. But for Bavinck, that 3-in-1 pattern is unique to God, and yet it's also, in some sense, Bavinck thought, revealed in the whole of the creation, but not through triadic patterns. Rather, the Trinity reveals the general principle and pattern of diverse things that exist together in unity. So the Trinity enables a creation that is like the Trinity, whilst the Trinity preserves itself as being unlike anything else within the creation. And I think that the Christian worldview is really consistent with that, where there's a really strongly Trinitarian. The Trinity is through all of this; it runs through the whole thing, but it's not stated explicitly because he's not trying to articulate a doctrine of the Trinity within the doctrine of God. So he's doing something different, but it's really profoundly Trinitarian, actually.
Yeah.
Right. It seems that his doctrine of the vestiges particularly then plays in here. And my own reading of Bavinck is that he significantly improves upon Augustine or Edwards, where Edwards and Augustine both tried to find these sort of forced triads within the created order in order to sort of prove the vestiges doctrine, whereas I think Bavinck takes a much more sort of sane approach, where the pattern of the one in many is found within creation, which is a revelation of the one in many within the original triune God. So it seems to me that is extremely significant when developing a Christian world life view, especially with an eye towards the university and sort of universal knowledge and science. So yeah, it's very good.
Yeah, and I think it's a useful point to revisit. The question. Bavinck's really Trinitarian, and that's the core of his worldview. And he's trying to articulate a Trinitarian worldview. Is Bavinck a social Trinitarian? Which I don't think he was at all. Obviously, that would be anachronistic anyway, because this develops post Bavinck. But I think Bavinck shows a very different way to think in a Trinitarian way, or the term that I use anyway in my writings is a triniform way about the world and about yourself and about the life that you will live in the world. And he manages to do that, showing that you do need to think about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and how you view the world and understand yourself and what you will be within the world. But you can do that in a way that also preserves the sheer uniqueness and otherness of the 3-in-1 formula of the Godhead. That preserves that also as a unique object of worship that you simply cannot find anywhere else. That transcends the world, and yet is also made immanent within it, and even into how you will live within the world. I think that's really profound, and it's something that's again prominent, albeit kind of subtle in this book as well, but really important.
It's important too to bring this discussion to bear on some of the contemporary discussions around worldview. It's interesting that the epistemic issue that Bavinck is critiquing in that first chapter, the failure to unite subject and object to create a sort of Kantian view all over again of the difference between representation and thing in itself, is exactly the critique, one of the common critiques against the concept of worldview today. That one of the common metaphors that has been used in a lot of worldview literature in the 20th century is the image of worldview as spectacles, as colored lenses, and everybody has a worldview. Everybody puts on glasses, and through those rose-colored glasses, they see the world. And so they're divided from the world, and there's sort of a Kantian, it's a Kantian metaphor almost that's been used for this idea. And Bavinck doesn't mean that. And it's interesting that he's critiquing exactly that problem in using Christian worldview to unify subject and object, to say that the presupposition is people actually do know the world through their representations as it is, to deny that Kantian dualism. And unfortunately, that's the way the worldview has been used, more like ideology than what Bavinck means by it. And it is important that we state that difference, because that's one of the domains that Worldview gets the most criticism from some of our colleagues in the Reformed world right now. So
it's the same thing with the word presupposition, right? I mean, that word has been sort of abused and misused and taken out of context, especially the way in which Van Til intended it, and has sort of been used as an idealistic bat that you could use to bop people over the head with, and charge them with bias or an inappropriate bias or whatnot. But anyway, it's a similar phenomenon, the way in which worldview and presupposition have been used and misused in our current day.
A better metaphor is map making, I think, for Bavinck. That developing worldview is more like map making. It's working and sketching boundaries and reworking and trying to constantly come back and understand the map you've been given, rather than something like spectacles through which you perceive reality.
Yeah. I wonder how much of that is borrowing from Calvin's discussion in Book 1 of the Institutes, where he talks about the spectacles of Scripture and whatnot. But of course, that was all being developed and used prior to the Enlightenment, and then post-Enlightenment here. Yeah, so you're advocating, something to me that sounds a lot more like, understanding an organic and Trinitarian foundation, situatedness, existence, but that notion of, I guess, maybe to coin a phrase, some sort of like divine archetypal and ectypal cartography. There we go. So, map making is a better way to think.
It's a cartography that we're using to justify the world as we experience it, right? It's because we've experienced it that we're looking for a domain for first principles that make sense of exactly what we do know, what we have experienced. So in that way, it's more like cartography than
wonderful.
Like
I'm wondering here then, with all this being said, and certainly we want people to purchase this book, from Crossway, Christian Worldview by Bavinck, but there are many other books by Bavinck that are also very important, and given his organicity and the very nature of his theological system and thought, it's helpful to not just know one sliver or one portion of what Bavinck is saying, but to kind of know the whole. So, a more practical question, certainly people could buy this book. It's not long. It's affordable, and people can read it and understand a good portion of it without a whole lot of background to Bavinck. Nevertheless, if either or any of you were to suggest some sort of program of becoming introduced to Bavinck, a program of reading or exposure, where might you situate this book? And would you recommend some other books or chapters or essays to help guide somebody into not just what Bavinck thought, but really how he thought? How would you suggest somebody just getting started to cut their teeth on the world of Bavinck?
I will say that it's important for the reader to know that this book does require at least some basic background in Western philosophy, probably, and that it's not a popular level read, and so it largely would depend on the reader to some degree, Kampen, and kind of where they're coming from and what their background is. But of course, the new edition of Magnalia Dei, the Wonderful Works of God, is a great place for anybody to start, because it's a popular level dogmatic text from Bavinck that's intended for everybody. I mean, that was his purpose in writing it. So, but I'd be interested in what the other guys have to say.
Yeah, so I think that it's interesting to look at this in Bavinck's own lifetime, because he was really committed to writing for the highest level of scholarly audience, and he aims his dogmatics at that. But in his own lifetime, there were criticisms of it in newspapers that it was too expensive, and you need to have a really high level of university education to appreciate it, and it's not the kind of thing that will end up on everyone's shelf. So after he finishes his dogmatics and then spends a long time, the best part of a decade, revising it to produce the second edition, he then invests years of his life in trying to write a shorter summary of it that he aims. So the first one of this is then aimed for kind of first and second year junior college level, university level students. But then after that, he then invested more time in writing a third book, which isn't out in English yet. A kind of handbook to the guidebook to the Christian religion, which is aimed at upper level high school students, so high school seniors. So it's more popular still, and he obviously writes so much in terms of journalism as well over his lifetime, which is explicitly aimed at a general popular audience. Christian Worldview, as Cory was saying, is aimed at university students, and again presupposes, as Cory said, knowledge of philosophy, presupposes that you know your way around just this kind of Calvinist culture that they're working in at the time. But there are other texts that I think you can use to try and get into Bavinck that are more introductory. So I released a book a couple of years ago called Herman Bavinck on Preaching and Preachers, which is designed in part to fill that need, where they are his texts on preaching and on church worship, and his only published sermon as well, which I think are fairly accessible to seminary students, to people who are used to listening to preaching. You know, this is Bavinck communicating his doctrine to ordinary people in the pew. So that book, I think, is a fairly accessible intro text. There's also the new biography that comes out next year, which is, I've tried to write it anyway, as some kind of overview of his life, but also his intellectual development. And I try and touch on all of the key works, including this one, and also his dogmatics as they develop, his Reformed ethics, to try and set them in some kind of a context as well, so that readers get who the person is who's producing these works in these times. So I hope that it's also a kind of map that helps you locate and understand better his publications as you interact with them. There's also an abridged version of his dogmatics, which is available in English. So that's 1 volume rather than 4. I don't know if, Gray, you want to chip in anything else?
I think that pretty much covers it all. I do think that this is one of the first stops we should go to if we're interested specifically in Bavinck's views on epistemology specifically. I do think that he represents this mature thought here very well, along with, of course, philosophy of revelation. So it would be interesting, I think, if somebody just picks up his Principles of Psychology, which isn't about psychology the way we would know it today,
right,
as if it's human behavior, but it's really a study of the cognition of all the human faculties, right? I mean, it's the various parts of the human soul, right? And so he talks about the distinction between representations and sensations, distinction between idea and impressions. These are very technical terms that he's defining in Principles of Psychology, which he wrote in 1897. And he's presupposing those definitions, I think, in this book. And he further works them out and teases them out in philosophy of revelation. So you'll have very nitpicky, it seems like anyway, nitpicky discussions on these particular concepts in philosophy of revelation. But he's really building on previous work on cognition before that.
That's brilliant. Well, there's so many places to go, so much to read now, and we're very thankful for the efforts of folks like you to provide this for many of us Anglophones who are now the recipients of the fruit of your labor by being able to read books like this in English. So this book is available now, I believe, Christian Worldview by Herman Bavinck. It's published by Crossway. Big thanks to them for getting on board and producing this book, and translated and edited by our guests today, Nathaniel Gray Sutanto, James Eglinton, and Cory Brock. Brothers, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. It's always wonderful to speak with you, and we thank you for your contribution.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
We'll have to talk soon, especially to you, James, as we await this critical biography of Bavinck next year. Is there any... I know book publishing is a goofy subject sometimes, but is there any estimate at when in the year we might expect it?
Yeah, so it should go to the printers in May.
Okay.
I hope it'll be available in June, so the summer.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to that very much so, and love to talk again at that time. But until then, you can find people online. You can find Crossway at crossway.org. You'll find information about the various institutions and places linked to in the episode description. And of course, we're online at reformedforum.org. You can get in touch with us through the contact page. All of our contact info is available online if you'd like to get a hold of us. But we encourage you to stay up to date in terms of what's going on the website and future events and publications and whatnot. We love hearing from you. But until the next time, we do want to thank everybody for listening, and we hope you join us again on that next time on Christ the Center.